The carriage door slammed shut before Elena Whitmore could steady her breath, and the sound echoed through the courtyard of Ashford Manor like a verdict. She had been married for exactly 4 hours, and already she understood that she was not welcome in this house. Duke Sebastian Ashford stood at the top of the stone steps, his dark coat unbuttoned, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, as if looking directly at her required an effort he was unwilling to give. Rain had begun to fall, thin and cold, and none of the servants moved to bring an umbrella. Elena lifted her skirts and climbed the steps alone, her wedding ring still unfamiliar on her finger, heavier than it had felt in the chapel only that morning. "Your Grace," she said, testing the title on her tongue as she reached the top step. Sebastian turned without a word and walked into the house. He did not offer his arm. He did not welcome her. He simply left her standing in the rain, and it was the housekeeper, a broad woman named Martha with kind eyes and a guarded mouth, who finally stepped forward to guide her inside. "This way, Your Grace," Martha said quietly. "Let's get you out of the wet." Elena followed her through a grand entrance hall lined with portraits of stern ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her every step. She had grown up hearing stories about Ashford Manor, about its wealth, its history, its cold beauty. She had not expected the cold to extend to its living inhabitants as well. 3 months earlier, Elena's father had called her into his study, his face gray with worry he had tried and failed to hide. Lord Bennet Whitmore was not a man given to displays of weakness, but that evening he had aged a decade in the span of an hour. Their family's finances, built on investments that had turned to dust, were beyond saving. Creditors were circling. The estate that had belonged to the Whitmore family for 4 generations was in danger of being sold to strangers. "There is one way," her father had said, unable to meet her eyes. "The Duke of Ashford has agreed to marry you. It would settle everything. Your mother's health, the house, your sister's future, all of it depends on this." Elena had not asked why a duke would want to marry a woman with no fortune and no title beyond what her father still clung to. She had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that there might be some flicker of genuine interest, some story yet to unfold. She learned the truth only days before the wedding, from a cousin who thought she was doing Elena a kindness by warning her. "He does not want this marriage," the cousin had whispered. "He was in love with someone else. Isabel Caro, her family forbade it, not enough money, not enough name. He was ordered to marry elsewhere, and the king's cousin, who owes your father a debt of honor, arranged this match instead. You are not his choice, Elena. You are his obligation." Elena had said nothing in response. She had simply nodded, tucked the words away like a stone in her pocket, and continued preparing for a wedding that would save her family and ruin, in its own quiet way, the rest of her life. Now walking through the halls of Ashford Manor for the first time as its Duchess, she understood the full weight of that warning. Every servant who passed her in the corridor offered a polite bow, but their eyes held a kind of pity that made her stomach turn. They already knew. Everyone in this house already knew that she was unwanted. Martha led her up a wide staircase and down a corridor lined with tall windows, rain streaking against the glass. At the end of the hall, she opened a door into a bedroom that was handsome but strangely bare, as though no one had lived in it in years. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but the room still held a chill that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the weather outside. "These will be your chambers, Your Grace," Martha said. "If you need anything, you have only to ring." "Thank you, Martha." Elena managed a small smile. "Is there somewhere I might find the Duke? I would like to speak with him." Something flickered across the housekeeper's face, hesitation, perhaps sympathy. "His Grace keeps to his study most evenings. I would not disturb him tonight if I were you. He is not himself when he first returns from—" She stopped abruptly, as though she had said too much. "Returns from what?" Martha's mouth pressed into a thin line. "It is not my place to say, Your Grace. Rest well. Dinner will be sent up if you'd prefer not to come down." The offer was, Elena understood, a mercy. She would not have to sit across a table from a husband who could not look at her. She accepted it, and Martha left her alone in the too-quiet room. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving her family home, to feel the full shape of her fear. She was 22 years old, married to a stranger who did not want her, living in a house where even the servants seemed to be holding their breath. She thought of her mother's frail hands gripping hers before the wedding, whispering that everything would be all right, that duty sometimes led to unexpected happiness. She thought of her younger sister, Charlotte, only 16, whose future now depended on Elena making this marriage work, whatever that meant. She did not cry. She had promised herself on the carriage ride to the church that she would not cry over a man who had already decided she was beneath his notice. Instead, she rose, crossed to the window, and looked out at the darkening grounds of her new home. Gardens stretched toward a distant tree line, elegant even in the rain, though clearly neglected in places, as if no one had cared for them properly in a long while. Somewhere out there, she suspected, was the truth about the man she had married, a truth that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with a woman named Isabel. Dinner arrived on a silver tray carried by a young maid who introduced herself shyly as Nora. Elena ate alone at a small writing desk, rather than the imposing dining table she had glimpsed on her way upstairs, and found she did not mind the solitude nearly as much as she minded the silence of the house itself. It was a silence with weight to it, the kind that came from people choosing carefully what not to say. After dinner, unable to settle into sleep despite the day's exhaustion, Elena wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and ventured quietly into the corridor. She told herself she was simply curious about her new home, though in truth she wanted to see, if only from a distance, the man she had married. She wanted to understand what kind of person could leave his bride standing in the rain. The manor at night was a different creature entirely from the manor by day, vast, echoing, lit only by scattered candles that threw long shadows against the walls. Elena moved carefully, unfamiliar with the layout, until she found herself near a half-open door at the end of a ground-floor hallway. Firelight spilled out onto the stone floor, and low voices drifted from within. She should not have listened. She knew this even as she slowed her steps and pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe. But the voice she heard, low, rough, unmistakably her husband's, held something she had not seen in his face all day, real feeling. "I cannot pretend this is what I wanted, Charles," Sebastian was saying. "You know precisely what I wanted, and it was not a stranger from a family drowning in debt." A second voice, warmer, more measured, answered him. "She seems a decent woman, Sebastian, perhaps in time." "Time will not change what cannot be changed," Sebastian cut in. "Isabel is a widow now, free for the first time since we were forced apart, and I am married to a woman I do not know, cannot love, and did not choose. Tell me, Charles, what good does time do for a man in my position?" Elena stood frozen against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give her away. She had already suspected the truth, had already been warned by her cousin, but hearing it spoken aloud in her husband's own voice was an entirely different kind of pain. It was the difference between reading of a wound and having it opened fresh. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked back toward the staircase, her steps quick and silent, her mind spinning with a single hardening resolve. She would not beg for his affection. She would not spend her marriage chasing after a man who had already given his heart to someone else. Whatever this life required of her, she would meet it with her head held high, even if no one in this house ever came to care for her at all. By the time she reached her chambers, the tears she had refused to shed earlier threatened again, hot and humiliating. She let herself sit on the edge of the bed and allow a few to fall quietly into the dark. Then she wiped her face, straightened her spine, and told herself the same thing she would repeat to herself many times in the difficult months ahead. She had not asked for this marriage, but she would not let it break her. Sleep came slowly that night, fractured by the unfamiliar sounds of a house not yet her own, the creak of old wood settling, the distant patter of rain against glass, the occasional murmur of servants moving through corridors even at this late hour. When Elena finally drifted off, she dreamed not of her husband, but of her family's modest house, of her mother's garden, of a life that had felt, for all its hardships, infinitely simpler than the one that now stretched before her. She woke before dawn to the sound of a door closing somewhere below, followed by hoofbeats fading into the distance. She rose and went to the window in time to see a lone rider disappearing down the long drive that led away from Ashford Manor, cloak billowing behind him in the gray morning light. She did not need to ask where he was going or to whom. Elena dressed herself that morning without calling for a maid, unwilling to face anyone's pitying glances so early in the day. She studied her reflection in the tall mirror across from her bed, a young woman with steady brown eyes and a jaw that she decided looked far more determined than she currently felt. Whatever waited for her in this house, she would face it without flinching. She had made a promise to her family, and she intended to keep it, whether or not her husband ever came to see her as anything more than an unwanted obligation. Downstairs, she found the breakfast room empty except for a place already set for one. A folded note sat beside her cup, written in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it carefully. Her Grace will find the household accounts and correspondence in the estate office, should she wish to familiarize herself with the running of the house. His Grace is occupied with business in town and does not expect to return before evening. There was no signature, no warmth, nothing to suggest the note had come from anyone who cared whether she felt welcome or not. Elena set it down and looked out the tall windows at the gardens beyond, still glistening from the previous night's rain. If her husband would not welcome her, she decided, she would find her own place in this house regardless. She would learn every corner of it, understand every ledger and letter, until Ashford Manor was no longer a stranger's home she had been delivered to, but something closer to her own. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had, and Elena Whitmore, now Elena Ashford, though the name still felt borrowed, was not the kind of woman to sit quietly and wait for happiness to arrive on someone else's terms. She finished her breakfast alone, rose from the table, and walked toward the estate office with her shoulders squared, ready to begin the long, uncertain work of building a life inside a marriage that had started with nothing but silence and rain. The estate office smelled of old paper and beeswax polish, and it took Elena less than an hour to realize that no one had properly managed it in a very long time. Ledgers sat in crooked stacks, some pages torn, others water-stained near the edges from a leak in the roof that had clearly gone unrepaired for months. Letters from tenants requesting repairs to their cottages lay unopened beneath a layer of dust. Bills from merchants in town were mixed carelessly with personal correspondence, several of them long overdue. Elena rolled up her sleeves, quite literally, and began to sort through the chaos with the same steady patience her mother had once used to mend torn linens, thread by thread, corner by corner, until something whole emerged from the mess. It was tedious work, but it gave her hands something to do and her mind something to focus on besides the ache that had settled in her chest since the previous night. By midday she had organized the ledgers by year and separated the tenant letters from the merchant bills. Several requests stood out to her immediately: a roof that had been leaking since winter, a bridge over the eastern stream that tenants said was unsafe for carts, a widow named Agnes Coleridge who had written 3 times asking for assistance after her husband's death left her unable to pay rent on her small plot of land. None of these letters had received a response. Elena felt a flash of anger on behalf of these strangers, tenants who depended on the Ashford estate for their livelihoods and had been met, it seemed, with the same silence she herself had encountered since arriving. She resolved then and there that whatever else her marriage might lack, she would not allow the people who depended on this house to suffer the same neglect she had. She found Henry, the butler, in the hallway outside the office and asked him to summon the estate steward, a Mr. Whitcomb, whom she had not yet met. Mr. Whitcomb does not typically report to. Henry hesitated, clearly unsure how to address the situation delicately. That is, His Grace usually handles matters of the estate himself, Your Grace, when he handles them at all. And when he does not handle them, then they simply wait, Your Grace. Elena nodded slowly, absorbing this. Please send for Mr. Whitcomb. I would like to discuss the tenant letters and the repairs that have been requested. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly, but he bowed and went to fetch the steward without further argument. Within the hour, a thin, nervous man in his 50s arrived at the office door, twisting his hat in his hands as though unsure whether he was in trouble. Your Grace, he said, bowing stiffly, I understand you wish to see me. Mr. Whitcomb, thank you for coming. Elena gestured to the stack of unanswered letters on the desk. I have found a number of requests from tenants that appear to have gone unaddressed. A leaking roof, an unsafe bridge, and a widow in genuine financial distress. I would like to understand why these matters have not been resolved. The steward's face flushed. His Grace has been occupied with other affairs, Your Grace. I raise these matters when I can, but without his authorization I am limited in what funds I may release. I see. Elena considered this for a moment, tapping her fingers lightly against the desk. Then I will authorize the repairs myself, if you will show me how such matters are typically approved. Mr. Whitcomb blinked, clearly startled by the suggestion. Your Grace, that is, it is not customary for the Duchess to. Is it against the law, Mr. Whitcomb? No, Your Grace, simply unusual. Then let us be unusual together, Elena said, with the faintest hint of a smile, for the sake of a widow who has been waiting 3 months for a response to a letter about her rent. Something in the steward's posture eased, as though he had been waiting a long time for someone in this house to take an interest in matters beyond its own walls. Over the following hour, he walked her through the estate's finances with visible relief, showing her which funds could be released for repairs, which accounts handled tenant disputes, and which correspondence required the Duke's personal seal rather than hers. By the time they finished, Elena had authorized repairs to the widow Coleridge's cottage, arranged for a mason to inspect the Eastern Bridge, and drafted a personal letter to Agnes Coleridge assuring her that her rent would be reduced for the next 6 months while she found steadier footing. It was not a grand gesture. It would not undo the humiliation of the previous night, or soften the words she had overheard her husband speak in the study. But it was something real, something she had built with her own hands in a single afternoon, and it left her feeling steadier than she had all day. She did not see Sebastian that evening either. He returned to the manor well after dark, and though Elena heard the sound of his boots in the corridor outside her door, he did not knock, and she did not call out to him. She had decided, somewhere between organizing the ledgers and writing to the widow Coleridge, that she would not chase after a man who had made his feelings so plain. If he wished to remain a stranger in his own house, she would let him. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Elena rose early, breakfasted alone, and spent her mornings in the estate office or walking the grounds with Mr. Whitcomb, learning the names of tenants and the particular troubles of each family. Sebastian, when he was present at all, kept to his study or disappeared for long rides that stretched from morning into evening. They crossed paths rarely, and when they did, their exchanges were brief and formal, a nod in the hallway, a murmured greeting over breakfast on the rare mornings he appeared, nothing more. It was on the 5th day that Elena first met Charlotte, Sebastian's younger sister, a bright, restless girl of 17 who arrived at the manor for an extended visit with an energy that seemed entirely out of place in such a quiet house. "You must be Elena," Charlotte said, bursting into the drawing room where Elena sat with a book she had not managed to read a single page of. "I've heard almost nothing about you, which I find terribly rude of my brother, so I've decided to form my own opinion instead." Elena set down her book, startled but not unpleasantly so. "And what opinion have you formed so far?" "That you look far too serious for someone who's only been married a week," Charlotte said, dropping into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Sebastian used to be dreadful about hiding his feelings too, you know, ever since everything with Isabel, but he wasn't always like this. When we were children, he was the one who taught me to ride, who used to sneak me sweets from the kitchen when our mother wasn't looking. I don't know when he became so closed off." Elena studied the younger girl carefully, unsure how much to say. "Your brother has made his feelings about our marriage quite clear, Lady Charlotte. I do not think familiarity will change much." "Please, just Charlotte." "And I don't believe that for a second." The girl leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I've been watching you since I arrived. You've already fixed Agnes Coleridge's rent troubles, arranged for the bridge to be repaired, and reorganized an entire office of ledgers that even our own father couldn't be bothered to sort through. That doesn't sound like a woman who's given up." "I haven't given up," Elena said quietly. "I simply don't intend to make a fool of myself begging for affection that isn't mine to have." Charlotte's expression softened, some of the playfulness draining away into something more thoughtful. "For what it's worth, I don't think he ever wanted to hurt you. I think he's simply been drowning in his own unhappiness for so long that he doesn't know how to see past it. My grandmother says grief makes people blind, even to kindness right in front of them." "Your grandmother's?" "Lady Margaret. She lives in the East Wing. You likely haven't met her yet since she rarely comes down for meals these days. Her health isn't what it used to be, and I think loneliness doesn't help matters. She was terribly fond of Isabel once, you know, before everything fell apart. I imagine she'd have opinions about all of this if anyone bothered to ask her." Something in Elena stirred at the mention of the elderly woman, a stranger perhaps, but one who might understand this house and its wounded air better than anyone else within its walls. "Perhaps I should introduce myself to her." "Perhaps you should," Charlotte agreed, smiling again. "Grandmother doesn't warm to people easily, but I have a feeling she might make an exception for you." That evening, after Charlotte had gone to change for dinner, Elena found herself wandering toward the east wing of the manor, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. The corridor there was narrower, quieter, lined with older portraits and faded wallpaper that spoke of a part of the house time had begun to forget. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, warm candlelight spilling from within. She knocked softly. "Lady Margaret, I hope I'm not intruding. I'm Elena, Sebastian's wife." A pause, then a voice, dry and papery but not unkind, called back, "Come in, child. I wondered how long it would take you to find your way up here." Elena pushed the door open and stepped into a room filled with books, faded tapestries, and the particular stillness of a life lived mostly in solitude. An elderly woman sat near the fire, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the room, her sharp eyes studying Elena with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time since arriving at Ashford Manor, genuinely seen. "Sit," Lady Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "You've been in this house nearly a week, and no one has thought to introduce you to me properly. That is a failing of my grandsons, not yours, so do not apologize for it." Elena sat carefully, unsure what to expect from this conversation. "Charlotte mentioned you might have some insight into the situation." "The situation?" Lady Margaret's mouth twitched, somewhere between amusement and sorrow. "Is that what we're calling my grandson's foolishness these days? Yes, I imagine I have insight into it. I watched him fall in love with Isabel Caro when he was barely 20 years old, and I watched her family break his heart when they refused the match. I also watched him agree to marry you without a single word of protest, which tells me more about his character than his silence toward you ever will." "He did not protest the marriage. He understood his duty even in his grief," Lady Margaret said. "That is not the same as wanting it, I grant you, but it is not nothing either. A man who truly did not care would have found a way to avoid the marriage entirely. There are always ways for a duke with enough influence. He did not look for one." Elena turned this thought over carefully, unsure whether it offered comfort or simply a different shade of the same painful truth. "He loves someone else, Lady Margaret. I heard him say so himself." The old woman's expression did not change, though something in her eyes grew gentler. Grief and love often wear the same face for a long time before a person learns to tell them apart. "I'm not asking you to wait for him, child. I would never ask any woman to build her happiness around a man's slow reckoning with his own heart. I am only telling you that this house has been cold and silent for far longer than you have lived in it, and in one short week, you have already begun to warm rooms that have not felt a fire in years. Whatever my grandson chooses to see or not see, that is worth something. Remember that, whatever happens next." Elena did not have an answer for that, not yet. But she left Lady Margaret's chambers that evening with something she had not carried with her since arriving at Ashford Manor, the faint, fragile beginning of hope, not for her husband's affection, but for a life of her own making within these walls, whether he ever chose to be part of it or not. Over the following days, Elena continued visiting Lady Margaret in the evenings, drawn by the old woman's sharp wit and unflinching honesty, a welcome contrast to the careful silences that governed the rest of the house. She learned slowly more of the family's history. Sebastian's father, stern and distant, who had died when Sebastian was only 19 and thrust the full weight of the dukedom onto his shoulders far too early. His mother, gone even earlier from an illness no physician could name. Isabel, whose family had once been close allies of the Ashfords, until ambition and a better offer from a wealthier suitor pulled her away. "He was never given the chance to grieve properly," Lady Margaret told her one evening, staring into the fire. "Not his father's death, not his mother's, and certainly not Isabel's leaving. He simply absorbed each loss and kept walking, because that is what dukes are taught to do. I fear now he does not know how to do anything else." Elena found herself thinking of those words often as she moved through the manor's quiet routines, sorting correspondence, meeting with tenants, sitting with Lady Margaret in the evenings while Sebastian remained, as ever, a distant and unreachable presence in his own home. She was not falling in love with him, not yet, not in any way she could name, but she was beginning, despite everything, to understand him. And understanding, she was learning, could be its own quiet, dangerous kind of door. A carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest rolled up the drive on a bright autumn morning, and the entire household seemed to hold its breath the moment word spread of who sat inside it. Elena was in the estate office when Nora burst in, her face pale with the particular urgency of servants who know a secret too large to keep politely to themselves. "Your Grace, forgive me, but I thought you should know at once. Mrs. Caro has arrived in town. Isabel Caro. Well, Isabel Hargrove now since her marriage, though I hear she's a widow these 6 months past. She's taken rooms at the Fairview house not 2 miles from here, and half the servants below stairs are already whispering about it." Elena set down her pen carefully, willing her hand not to tremble. "Thank you for telling me, Nora." The maid hesitated at the door. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I thought it right you should hear it from me rather than stumble upon it unprepared." "You were right to tell me, that was kind of you." Nora bobbed a quick curtsy and hurried away, leaving Alina alone with news that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every corner of the calm she had worked so hard to build over the past weeks. Isabel Caro, the woman whose name had haunted every silence in this house since Alina's arrival, was no longer a memory kept safely at a distance. She was 2 miles away, free of any husband, and utterly available to a man who had never stopped loving her. Alina told herself quite firmly that this changed nothing. She had already known the truth of her husband's heart before she ever set foot in Ashford Manor. Isabel's return did not create a wound, it merely exposed one that had existed all along. And yet, despite every rational argument she offered herself throughout that long afternoon, she found she could not entirely quiet the anxious unease that had settled beneath her ribs. She saw the effect on Sebastian almost immediately. Where he had been distant before, cool and formal in the rare moments they crossed paths, he now became something closer to restless. He left the manor earlier each morning and returned later each evening, his clothes sometimes carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and rain, as though he had spent hours out riding rather than attending to whatever business he claimed occupied him in town. At dinner, on the increasingly rare occasions he joined her at all, his eyes seemed perpetually fixed on some point beyond the walls of the dining room, his responses to her polite questions growing shorter and more distracted by the day. Alina said nothing about any of it. She had promised herself, that first difficult night, that she would not chase a man who had already given his heart elsewhere, and she intended to keep that promise even as the temptation to ask him directly grew sharper with each passing day. It was Charlotte, inevitably, who finally broke the careful silence surrounding the subject. "You must have heard by now," she said one afternoon, finding Alina in the gardens where she had taken to walking in the hours before dusk. "Everyone in the county has heard. Isabel Hargrove, back after all these years, conveniently widowed and conveniently within riding distance of Ashford Manor." "I've heard," Alina said simply, continuing her walk along the gravel path without slowing her pace. Charlotte fell into step beside her, uncharacteristically quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I don't know what he intends to do about it. I don't think he knows either, honestly. But I do know this, my brother has never once, in all the years I've watched him grieve for that woman, looked half so troubled as he has these past few days. Something in him is at war with itself. That is his concern to sort through, not mine," Alina said, though the words felt more hollow than she wanted to admit, even to herself. "Is it though?" Charlotte stopped walking, forcing Alina to turn and face her. "You're his wife, Alina. Whatever happens with Isabel affects you as much as it affects him, whether either of you wants to admit that or not." Alina did not have a ready answer for that. She simply resumed walking, and after a moment Charlotte let the subject drop, though the weight of it lingered in the air between them for the rest of their walk. That evening, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Alina descended to the library in search of a book that might quiet her restless mind. She had not expected to find Sebastian there, standing near the tall windows with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand, staring out at the darkened gardens with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the cool indifference he usually wore, but something closer to genuine anguish. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and for a brief moment, something like surprise flickered across his features before the familiar guardedness settled back into place. "Forgive me," Alina said, already moving to leave. "I did not realize the library was occupied." "You needn't leave on my account." His voice was rougher than usual, weighted with something he seemed to be fighting to keep contained. "This is your home as much as mine, whatever else may be true between us." The admission startled her enough that she paused near the doorway rather than continuing on. "That is the first time you've called this my home." Something flickered across his face, regret perhaps, or simple exhaustion. "I have not been a fair husband to you, Alina. I am aware of that, whatever it may look like from where you stand. I have not asked you to be anything you cannot be," she said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate care. "I understood the nature of this marriage before I ever arrived at Ashford Manor. You need not explain yourself to me." "And yet I find myself wanting to," he said, so quietly she nearly missed it entirely. He set down the untouched brandy and turned to face her fully for what felt like the first time since their wedding day. "Isabel's return has stirred up matters I believed I had long since settled within myself. I find I am not as settled as I believed." Alina felt something tighten painfully in her chest, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "You need not explain your feelings for her to me, Your Grace. I am aware of them already." "How would "I overheard you," she admitted, seeing no reason now to hide it. "That first night speaking with your friend Charles in this very room. I know what you feel for her and what you feel or do not feel for me. You need not carry the burden of explaining it further." Sebastian's face went pale, then flushed with what might have been shame. "Elena, please," her voice, though quiet, carried enough steel to stop him mid-sentence. "I did not come here tonight to discuss any of this. I came for a book, nothing more. Whatever you decide regarding Isabel Hargrove is entirely your own affair. I have made my peace with the terms of this marriage, and I do not intend to spend my remaining years here waiting for feelings that were never mine to claim." She retrieved a book at random from the nearest shelf, barely registering its title, and left the library without another word, her spine straight, her step steady, though her hands trembled faintly the moment she was safely out of his sight. That night, alone in her chambers, Elena allowed herself finally to grieve, not for a love she had never truly had, but for the particular loneliness of being married to a man whose heart belonged so completely and so publicly to someone else. She thought of her mother's assurances before the wedding, that duty sometimes led to unexpected happiness, and wondered whether her mother had simply never imagined a duty quite so thoroughly hopeless as this one. But even in her grief, something hardened within her that night, some final resolve settling into place. She would not spend her marriage as a woman waiting to be chosen. Whatever Sebastian decided to do about Isabel Hargrove, Elena intended to build a life of her own within these walls, one rooted in purpose, in the tenants she had come to know, in Lady Margaret's evening company, in Charlotte's growing friendship, in the slow, steady work of making Ashford Manor a place worth living in, regardless of whether her husband ever came to see her as anything more than an obligation fulfilled. Word soon reached the manor that Isabel Hargrove had been seen at several local gatherings, always elegantly dressed, always trailing a quiet awareness of who might be watching and reporting back to the Duke. Elena heard the report secondhand, through Charlotte's occasional updates or the careless chatter of servants who did not always remember to lower their voices when she passed. She learned that Isabel had attended a dinner hosted by the county magistrate, where Sebastian had also been present. She learned that the two had spoken for nearly an hour in the garden while other guests danced inside, a detail that traveled through the servants' quarters with the speed of a fire through dry grass. Elena did not confront Sebastian about any of it. She had made her decision in the library that night, and she intended to hold to it, however difficult the days ahead might prove. Instead, she threw herself further into the work of the estate, finding in it a purpose that no amount of gossip could diminish. She expanded her efforts beyond the tenant repairs she had already arranged, establishing a small fund drawn from her own modest personal allowance and later supplemented without comment by Mr. Whitcomb from estate accounts he was clearly relieved to see put to good use, to assist tenant families through the difficult winter months ahead. She organized a schoolroom in the village for children whose parents could not otherwise afford tutoring, recruiting the vicar's unmarried daughter, a bright young woman named Prudence, to teach basic reading and arithmetic 3 mornings a week. The tenants, who had watched dukes and duchesses come and go with little personal involvement in their daily struggles, began to speak of the new duchess with a warmth that surprised even Elena herself. Agnes Coleridge, whose rent troubles Elena had resolved in her very first week at Ashford Manor, took to leaving small gifts at the kitchen door, a jar of preserves, a bundle of fresh herbs, simple tokens of gratitude that meant more to Elena than she quite knew how to express. Lady Margaret, hearing of these efforts during their nightly conversations, regarded Elena with something approaching pride. "You are doing what my grandson should have been doing all along," she said one evening, her sharp eyes softened by the firelight. "Do not let anyone in this house make you believe your worth here depends on whether he ever chooses to see it. You have already made yourself indispensable to this estate, whether he acknowledges it or not." "I do not do it for his acknowledgement," Elena said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the words were entirely true. "No," Lady Margaret agreed, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I did not think you did. That is precisely why it matters so much." Still, despite her determination to build a life independent of her husband's affections, Elena could not entirely escape the growing tension that Isabel's presence had introduced into the household. Sebastian's absences grew longer, his moods darker, his rare appearances at dinner marked by a distracted silence that even Charlotte's determined cheerfulness could not fully penetrate. Elena watched him from across the table some evenings, studying the furrow of his brow, the way his hand sometimes tightened around his glass as though bracing against some internal storm, and found herself wondering, despite every resolution she had made, what exactly was happening within him. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself this many times, in many quiet moments throughout those difficult weeks. And yet some small, stubborn part of her continued to watch him, continued to wonder, continued to notice each new sign of his unraveling with an attention she could not quite convince herself was born purely of indifference. One evening, returning from the village schoolroom later than usual, Alina encountered Sebastian in the entrance hall, his coat still damp from the evening air, his expression more open and unguarded than she had seen it since their wedding day. He looked, for a brief unguarded moment, like a man carrying a weight far too heavy for one person to bear alone. "You've been to the village," he said, not quite a question. "I have. The schoolroom needed new slates for the children. I arranged for a shipment from town." Alina kept her tone carefully neutral, unwilling to reveal how much his sudden attention unsettled her. "I heard about the schoolroom, and the winter fund for the tenants." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It is more than I have managed to arrange for this estate in years, and you have accomplished it in a matter of weeks." "Someone needed to," Alina said simply. "The tenants deserved better than they were receiving." Sebastian's jaw tightened, something like shame flickering across his features before he could smooth it away. "You are right to say so. I have not been the steward this estate deserved, not for a long while now." Alina studied him carefully, uncertain what to make of this unexpected honesty. "Why are you telling me this now?" He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might simply retreat back into his customary silence, as he had so many times before. But instead he took a step closer, his voice dropping lower, more uncertain than she had ever heard it. "Because I find myself noticing things about this house I had stopped noticing years ago. The gardens look different than they did a month ago. The tenants speak of you with a warmth I have not heard directed at anyone in this family in a long time. My grandmother, who has not left her chambers for dinner in nearly 2 years, asked only last week whether you might join her for supper in the East Wing, an invitation she has extended to almost no one since my mother passed. I find myself wondering, Alina, what kind of woman accomplishes all of this in a matter of weeks, while I have spent years accomplishing nothing at all." Alina's heart beat unsteadily in her chest, caught between the guarded resolve she had built so carefully and the unexpected vulnerability of this moment. "I did not do any of it to earn your notice, Your Grace." "I know," he said quietly. "That is perhaps precisely why I have finally begun to notice it." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the entrance hall silent around them save for the faint patter of rain that had begun again outside. Alina felt the familiar urge to retreat, to protect the careful walls she had built around her heart these past weeks. But something in Sebastian's expression, some genuine uncertainty, some crack in the armor he had worn since her arrival, held her in place a moment longer than she intended. "It is late," she finally said, breaking the silence before it could deepen into something she was not yet ready to face. "I should retire for the evening." "Of course." Sebastian stepped back, allowing her passage toward the staircase, though his eyes followed her with an intensity that had not been present in any of their previous exchanges. "Alina." She paused at the base of the stairs, glancing back. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything you have done for this house, whether or not I have earned the right to thank you for it." Alina did not trust herself to answer. She simply nodded once and continued up the staircase, leaving him standing alone in the entrance hall, the rain growing heavier against the windows behind him. She did not know what to make of this sudden shift in him, this unexpected crack in the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival. She told herself, climbing the stairs toward her solitary chambers, that she would not allow herself to hope for anything more than what already existed between them. Hope, she had learned in these past weeks, was a dangerous thing to carry into a marriage built on obligation rather than love. And yet, despite every warning she offered herself that night, some small, stubborn ember of hope refused entirely to be extinguished. A fever swept through the East Wing in the second week of November, and it was Lady Margaret who fell ill first, her frail body succumbing to a cough that rattled through the quiet corridors like a warning bell. Alina heard of it before Sebastian did, summoned from her morning walk by a frantic Nora who had found the old woman collapsed near her fireplace, too weak to reach the bell pull that would have summoned help. "Send for the physician at once," Alina said, already moving toward the East Wing without waiting for anyone else to take charge. "And bring fresh water, clean linens, and whatever willow bark the kitchen has on hand for the fever. By the time Dr. Edmund Halloway arrived from the village, Elena had already settled Lady Margaret into bed, cooled her brow with damp cloths, and coaxed a few sips of broth past her cracked lips. The physician, a stout man with kind eyes and steady hands, examined the elderly woman carefully before delivering his verdict with the gentle bluntness of a man long accustomed to difficult conversations. "Her heart is not what it once was, Your Grace, and this fever taxes it severely. The next 2 days will tell us a great deal. I would not leave her alone if I were you. Fevers of this kind can turn quickly, particularly in patients of her age." Elena nodded, already rolling up her sleeves in preparation for what she understood, without needing to be told, would be a long and difficult vigil. "I will stay with her." "Your Grace, surely the household staff can manage the nursing," Dr. Halloway said, clearly surprised. "It is unusual for a duchess to—" "I am aware it is unusual," Elena said, echoing, almost without realizing it, the same words she had once offered Mr. Whitcomb in the estate office. "I intend to stay with her regardless." The physician, recognizing the futility of further argument, simply nodded and left instructions for the fever's management before departing with a promise to return the following morning. Word of Lady Margaret's illness reached Sebastian by midday, and he arrived at the East Wing with an urgency Elena had not seen in him since her arrival at Ashford Manor. He found her exactly where she had remained for the past several hours, seated at his grandmother's bedside, gently pressing a cool cloth to the old woman's fevered brow while murmuring quiet reassurances that seemed to ease, however slightly, the elderly woman's labored breathing. "How is she?" Sebastian asked, his voice tight with a fear Elena had rarely heard from him. "The fever has not broken yet, but Dr. Halloway believes the next 2 days are critical. I have given her willow bark for the fever and broth to keep up her strength, though she has taken very little." Elena did not look up from her task, focused entirely on wringing out the cloth and returning it, freshly cooled, to Lady Margaret's brow. "You should sit with her if you're able. I imagine your presence would comfort her should she wake." Sebastian moved to the opposite side of the bed, lowering himself into the chair there with the careful stiffness of a man unused to sitting vigil over the people he loved. He watched his grandmother's shallow breathing for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "You needn't stay through the night, Elena. I can send for Martha to relieve you." "I would rather stay," Elena said simply. "She has been kind to me since my arrival, kinder than most in this house. I would not feel right leaving her now." Something in Sebastian's expression shifted at this, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, or something closer to genuine gratitude. He said nothing further, but he did not leave either, remaining at his grandmother's bedside through the long hours of that difficult afternoon, watching Elena tend to the old woman with a quiet, unwavering diligence that seemed to unsettle something within him he did not yet have words for. The fever did not break that night. Elena remained at Lady Margaret's bedside through the darkest hours, changing cool cloths, coaxing sips of broth and water past cracked lips, murmuring soft reassurances whenever the old woman stirred restlessly in her fevered sleep. Sebastian, despite her earlier suggestion that he need not stay, remained as well, dozing occasionally in his chair but waking each time his grandmother's breathing changed, watching Elena's steady, tireless care with an expression she could not quite read in the dim candlelight. Near dawn, exhausted beyond measure, Elena finally allowed herself to rest her head against the edge of the bed for a few stolen minutes, her hand still resting lightly on Lady Margaret's own. She did not notice Sebastian rise from his chair, did not notice him retrieve a blanket from a nearby chest and drape it carefully over her shoulders, did not notice the long moment he spent simply watching her sleep before returning, quietly, to his own vigil at his grandmother's bedside. When Elena woke an hour later, disoriented and immediately anxious about how long she had dozed, she found the blanket around her shoulders and Sebastian still seated across from her, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion but fixed, unmistakably, on her rather than on his grandmother. "You should rest properly," he said quietly. "I can watch her for a while." "I'm fine," Elena said, though the ache in her back and the weight behind her eyes suggested otherwise. She checked Lady Margaret's brow and found it, to her immense relief, slightly cooler than it had been the previous evening. "I believe the fever may be breaking." Sebastian leaned forward immediately, checking his grandmother's condition for himself, and something in his face, relief, gratitude, an emotion too complicated to name simply, settled into place as he confirmed what Elena had already noticed. "Thank God." They sat together in silence for a while after that, watching Lady Margaret's breathing grow steadier by the hour. The two of them united, however briefly, by shared relief and shared exhaustion in a way that felt entirely different from the careful distance that had governed their marriage since its beginning. "You did not have to do any of this," Sebastian finally said, breaking the silence. "The nursing, the vigil, all of it. You could have left it to the servants and no one would have thought less of you for it." "She matters to me," Alina said simply. "Whatever else may or may not be true in this house, that much is not complicated." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Alina could not quite name. "You continue to surprise me, Alina, in every way since the moment you arrived. I did not realize I was meant to be predictable." A faint, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since her arrival at Ashford Manor. "No. I suppose you were not." Lady Margaret's fever broke fully by the following afternoon, and though her recovery would take several more weeks of careful rest, Dr. Halloway declared the immediate danger past. The old woman, once lucid enough to understand what had transpired during her illness, fixed Alina with a look that held more warmth than words could easily express. "You stayed with me through the worst of it," Lady Margaret said, her voice still weak but her sharp eyes as clear as ever. "Sebastian tells me you barely left my bedside for 2 days." "I could not have done otherwise," Alina said, adjusting the pillows behind the old woman's back with practiced care. "No," Lady Margaret said, studying her granddaughter-in-law with something approaching quiet awe. "I imagine you could not have. You are not the kind of woman who abandons what matters to her, are you, even when it would be far easier to do so?" Alina did not have a ready answer for that, but she found, in the weeks that followed, that Lady Margaret's illness had shifted something within the household in ways she had not anticipated. Sebastian, though still often distant and preoccupied, began seeking Alina out with a frequency that had not existed before, asking after estate matters she had once handled entirely without his awareness, joining her occasionally on her walks through the gardens, lingering at dinner rather than retreating immediately to his study the moment the meal concluded. It was not affection, not exactly, not anything Alina felt able to name with any certainty. But it was attention, genuine and unforced, and after weeks of careful invisibility within her own marriage, Alina found she did not know quite what to do with the unfamiliar warmth of being finally seen. Charlotte noticed the shift as well, remarking on it during one of their now regular afternoon walks through the gardens, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot as the season turned steadily toward winter. "He asked about you 3 times at breakfast this morning," Charlotte said, unable to hide her amusement. "Whether you'd slept well, whether the schoolroom needed anything further, whether you intended to visit the village again this week. I don't believe my brother has asked 3 questions about anyone besides himself in as many years. He is simply grateful for the nursing during Lady Margaret's illness," Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, she suspected they did not fully capture whatever was shifting between herself and her husband. "Perhaps," Charlotte said, unconvinced, "or perhaps he is finally beginning to see what the rest of us have seen for weeks now." Alina did not ask what Charlotte meant by that. Uncertain, she was ready to hear an answer that might unsettle the careful equilibrium she had built for herself these past difficult months. But she found herself thinking of the question often in the days that followed, turning it over in quiet moments, unable to fully silence the small, stubborn hope that had taken root within her despite every effort to prevent it. Isabel Hargrove's presence in the county had not diminished during this time, and word occasionally still reached the manor of her continued social engagements, her lingering conversations with various local gentlemen, her careful, persistent visibility in circles that inevitably intersected with Sebastian's own. Alina told herself these reports no longer troubled her as they once had, though she suspected, in her more honest moments, that this was not entirely true. Still, something had changed within the walls of Ashford Manor since Lady Margaret's illness, some quiet thaw in the careful distance that had defined Alina's marriage since its beginning. She did not yet know what to make of it, did not yet trust herself to hope for more than the fragile, uncertain warmth that had begun, however tentatively, to grow between herself and the husband who had once left her standing alone in the rain. But she noticed it nonetheless, in the small moments that accumulated slowly over the following weeks, the way Sebastian's eyes lingered on her a beat longer than necessary during dinner, the way he began remembering small details of her days without being told, The way his voice, when he spoke to her now, carried none of the cold formality that had once defined every exchange between them. Elena did not know where this fragile, uncertain thaw might lead, but for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to wonder, quietly and without fully admitting it even to herself, whether the life she had been given might yet become something more than the obligation it had begun as. The letter arrived folded inside a book Elena had borrowed from the library, tucked so carelessly between its pages that she nearly missed it entirely while searching for a passage Lady Margaret had recommended. It was not addressed to her. The handwriting, elegant and unfamiliar, bore Sebastian's name alone, and the moment Elena recognized the signature at its close, her chest tightened with a dread she could not immediately explain. Isabelle. She should not have read it. She told herself this even as her eyes moved helplessly across the page, unable to stop once she had begun. The letter spoke of stolen years, of a love that circumstance alone had interrupted rather than ended, of a widow now free to reclaim what fate had once denied her. It spoke, too, of a marriage entered into out of duty rather than desire, one that Isabelle seemed entirely confident would eventually dissolve under the weight of feelings that had never truly changed. I know you still love me, Sebastian, the letter read. I have seen it in your eyes every time we have spoken since my return. Marriages of convenience are not unbreakable, particularly when both parties understand the truth of where a man's heart truly belongs. I am willing to wait if waiting is what circumstance requires. But I do not believe, not for a moment, that you intend to spend the rest of your life pretending otherwise. Elena set the letter down with hands that had begun, despite every effort at composure, to tremble. She told herself this changed nothing she had not already known, that Isabelle's confidence in Sebastian's lingering affection was hardly a revelation after everything she had overheard and observed since her arrival at Ashford Manor. And yet something about seeing the words written so plainly, so confidently, in Isabelle's own careful hand, cut deeper than any overheard conversation ever had. She did not confront Sebastian about the letter immediately. She told herself she needed time to steady her thoughts, though in truth she suspected she was simply afraid of what his reaction might reveal, whether he would deny Isabelle's confidence entirely, or whether some flicker of guilt in his expression would confirm every fear Elena had worked so hard to bury these past weeks. The opportunity to raise the matter arrived sooner than she anticipated, that same evening, when Sebastian found her in the library once more, this time searching in earnest for the book she had originally intended to borrow. "You seem troubled," he observed, watching her from the doorway with the careful attentiveness that had become increasingly familiar since Lady Margaret's illness. "Is something wrong?" Elena considered for a long moment whether to raise the subject of the letter at all. But something in her, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps simple weariness with the careful diplomacy that had governed every interaction between them for months, pushed the words forward before she could reconsider. "I found a letter," she said, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "From Isabelle Hargrove. It had been left inside a library book I borrowed." Sebastian's expression shifted immediately, color draining from his face in a way that told Elena, more clearly than any words could have, that he understood exactly which letter she meant. "Elena, I did not intend for you to." "I did not ask whether you intended it," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am simply telling you that I read it, and that I understand now with perfect clarity precisely where matters stand between the two of you." "Nothing has happened between us," Sebastian said quickly, though his voice carried an uncertainty that undermined the very reassurance he seemed to be attempting. "I have not encouraged her, Elena. Whatever she believes about my feelings, I have given her no reason to." "Have you not?" Elena asked, and though her voice remained quiet, it carried an edge she had not allowed herself before, not once in all their months of careful, guarded distance. "You have spent countless evenings away from this house since her return. You spoke with her for an hour in a garden while your own wife sat alone at home. And now she writes to you with such confidence about the state of your heart that I find myself wondering whether that confidence is entirely unfounded, or whether it is simply the truth you have not yet found the courage to say aloud, to me or to yourself." Sebastian said nothing for a long moment, and his silence, more than any denial could have, told Elena everything she needed to know. "I see," she said quietly, and turned to leave the library before he could offer whatever careful, insufficient explanation he seemed to be searching for. "Elena, wait." His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a rawness she had not heard from him before. I do not know what I feel anymore. That is the truth of it, as much as I wish I could offer you something more certain. I have spent so many years grieving what I lost with Isabel that I do not entirely know how to separate old feeling from new confusion. But I know that these past weeks, watching you with my grandmother, with the tenants, with Charlotte, I have begun to feel something I did not expect to feel toward you, something I have not fully understood myself, let alone found the words to explain. That is not an answer, Sebastian, Elena said, her voice tight with an emotion she refused to let fully surface. That is simply confusion dressed in kinder words. I cannot build my life around a man who does not know his own heart, waiting endlessly for him to decide whether I am worth choosing over the memory of a woman he has loved for a decade. She left the library then, and Sebastian did not follow her, though she heard faintly the sound of something breaking against the far wall of the room behind her, a glass perhaps thrown in frustration or grief or some tangled combination of both. She did not look back to find out which. In the days that followed, Elena found herself retreating further into the steady, purposeful work that had sustained her since her earliest weeks at Ashford Manor. She threw herself into the schoolroom's expansion, arranging for additional tutoring in the afternoons for older children who wished to continue their studies beyond basic reading and arithmetic. She organized a winter festival for the tenants, drawing on childhood memories of similar celebrations at her family's more modest estate, determined to bring some warmth and joy into a community that had for too long been left to fend largely for itself. She spoke with Sebastian only when circumstances required it, her tone carefully polite, carefully distant, a return to the guarded formality of their earliest days together, though now colored by a grief that had not existed before, grief for a fragile warmth she had allowed herself to hope for, however briefly, before Isabel's letter had reminded her with brutal clarity exactly where she stood. Lady Margaret, recovering steadily but still confined largely to her chambers, noticed the shift immediately during their nightly visits, her sharp eyes missing nothing despite her continued frailty. "You have retreated again," the old woman observed one evening, studying Elena's carefully composed expression with obvious concern. "What happened between you and my grandson?" Elena hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, before finally recounting, in careful, measured words, the discovery of Isabel's letter and the conversation that had followed. Lady Margaret listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "He is a fool," she said finally, once Elena had finished. "A grieving, confused fool who does not yet understand what stands directly in front of him. But I do not believe, child, that his confusion is the same thing as certainty about Isabel. I have watched that boy for 30 years, and I have never once seen him look at Isabel, Caro, the way he has begun looking at you these past weeks. His looks mean little if he cannot offer certainty alongside them," Elena said, unable to fully mask the weariness in her voice. "I will not spend my life as a woman waiting patiently for a man to finish grieving someone else before he finds room in his heart for me." "No," Lady Margaret agreed quietly. "You should not have to. I only hope, for both your sakes, that he comes to understand that before it is too late for him to do anything about it." Elena did not respond to this, uncertain what response could possibly capture the tangled grief and resolve that had settled within her since discovering Isabel's letter. She simply sat with Lady Margaret a while longer, grateful for the old woman's steady, undemanding company, before retiring to her own chambers for another long, solitary night. Winter arrived in earnest over the following weeks, blanketing the estate grounds in snow and forcing the household into the closer, more confined rhythms that came with the season's harsher weather. Elena continued her work with the tenants and the schoolroom, finding in the season's demands a welcome distraction from the careful distance that had once again settled between herself and Sebastian. The winter festival, when it finally arrived, drew tenants from across the estate to the manor's great hall, where Elena had arranged for food, music, and small gifts for the children who had spent recent months learning their letters and numbers in the village schoolroom. The evening unfolded with a warmth Elena had not witnessed within these walls since her arrival, laughter echoing through corridors that had once felt perpetually silent, children's voices rising in delighted excitement over simple treats and games, tenants speaking with genuine affection about the young duchess who had transformed their circumstances in ways their previous landlords had never troubled themselves to consider. Sebastian attended the festival as well, though he remained largely at its edges, watching the proceedings with an expression Elena found difficult to read from across the crowded hall. She did not approach him, and he did not approach her, though she was aware, throughout the evening, of his eyes following her movements through the room with an attentiveness that felt entirely different from mere obligation. It was near the evening's end, as tenants began gathering their children and preparing for the cold journey back to their cottages, that Sebastian finally approached her, his expression carrying none of the confusion or hesitation of their previous conversation. "You have built something remarkable here," he said quietly, gesturing toward the hall still alive with the last traces of the evening's warmth. "I do not believe this estate has seen an evening like this in all the years since my father's passing." "The tenants deserved it," Elena said simply, unwilling to allow herself any illusions about what this conversation might or might not represent. "They did," Sebastian agreed, "and so I have come to understand, do you?" He paused, seeming to search for words that did not come easily to him. "I have thought a great deal about what you said to me, Elena, in the library, about certainty and about what you deserve from a marriage, from a husband. I do not have easy answers to offer you yet. But I want you to know that I have not written to Isabel since receiving her letter, and I do not intend to." Elena studied him carefully, uncertain how much weight to place on this admission after everything that had passed between them. "That is not the same as certainty, Sebastian." "No," he agreed quietly, "but it is a beginning, if you are willing to allow me the chance to find my way toward it." Elena did not answer immediately, the weight of months of careful guardedness making it difficult to simply accept the fragile olive branch he seemed to be offering. But something in his expression, a sincerity she had not seen from him since their earliest, most painful days together, softened, however slightly, the wall she had built around her heart in the weeks since Isabel's letter. "We shall see," she said finally, offering neither full forgiveness nor full rejection, but something more honest than either, a cautious willingness to wait and watch, without any further illusions about what that waiting might ultimately cost her. Smoke was already thick over the tenant village by the time the first rider reached the manor, shouting through the courtyard with a panic that sent servants scattering in every direction. Elena was in the estate office reviewing winter accounts when Henry burst through the door, his usually composed face wild with alarm. "Fire, your grace, the Coleridge cottage and the two beside it, it's spreading fast in this wind, and half the men are away at the timber sale in town." Elena was on her feet before he finished speaking, already reaching for her cloak. "How many families?" "6, your grace, perhaps more if the wind carries it further down the row." "Send for every able hand in the house, buckets, blankets, anything that can carry water. And send someone for Dr. Halloway now, before we need him rather than after." Elena was already moving toward the door, her mind racing through everything she had learned these past months about the village's layout, its narrow lanes that would make any rescue effort difficult if handled carelessly. She found Sebastian in the stable yard, already mounting his horse, his face set with the same grim urgency that had gripped the entire household in the span of a few frantic minutes. He caught sight of her, and for a moment seemed to consider ordering her to remain behind. Whatever he saw in her expression apparently changed his mind. "Ride with me," he said instead, and Elena did not waste time being surprised by the offer. She mounted her own horse, and together they rode hard toward the village, the smell of smoke growing sharper with every passing minute. The scene that greeted them was chaos, flames leaping high against the gray winter sky, tenants running with buckets from the village well, children crying while frightened mothers tried desperately to account for every member of their families. Agnes Coleridge stood near her burning cottage, her face streaked with soot and tears, screaming a name that made Elena's blood run cold. "My boy! My Thomas is still inside. He was sleeping when the fire started, and I could not reach him through the smoke." Sebastian was off his horse and moving toward the burning cottage before Elena could fully process what was happening, shouting for someone to bring wet cloth, for anyone to help him reach the small back window where Agnes insisted her son's room stood. Elena's heart seized with fear as she watched her husband disappear around the side of the burning structure, but she forced herself to focus, calling out instructions to the tenants gathering nearby, organizing the water brigade with the same steady clarity she had brought to every crisis since her arrival at Ashford Manor. "Form 2 lines from the well to here. Pass the buckets quickly, don't waste a single one. Someone find blankets to soak. We need to protect the cottages still untouched before the wind carries the flames further down the row." The tenants, already trusting her leadership after months of her steady presence in their lives, organized themselves with remarkable speed despite their terror. Elena worked alongside them, her hands blistering from the rough rope handles of water buckets passed frantically down the line, her eyes darting repeatedly toward the burning cottage where Sebastian had disappeared, praying with every fiber of her being that he would emerge safely, and soon. Long minutes passed, minutes that felt to Elena like hours, before a shout went up from the cottage's far side. Sebastian emerged through a cloud of smoke, coughing violently, a small boy clutched tightly against his chest, both of them coated in soot but, to Elena's overwhelming relief, alive and breathing. Agnes Coleridge collapsed to her knees at the sight, sobbing with a relief so profound it seemed to shake her entire body as she gathered her son into her arms. Elena rushed to Sebastian's side, checking him for injuries with hands that trembled far more than she wanted to admit. "Are you hurt? Sebastian, look at me, are you burned anywhere?" "I'm fine," he managed between coughs, though his voice was rough and his eyes streamed from the smoke. "The boy is he. He's breathing, he's safe, thanks to you." Elena's voice cracked slightly despite her best efforts at composure. "You could have been killed, Sebastian. You should not have gone in there alone." "I could not simply stand outside and listen to a mother scream for her child," Sebastian said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Not when I had the chance to do something about it." There was no time to dwell further on the danger he had faced. The fire still raged, and Elena turned her attention back to organizing the tenants' desperate efforts, working alongside Sebastian now as they coordinated the water brigade, directed families to safety, and worked to contain the flames before they could spread to the remaining cottages in the row. By the time the fire was finally brought under control, hours had passed, and both Elena and Sebastian were exhausted, soot-streaked, and hollow with the particular weariness that came after facing genuine danger together. 3 cottages had been lost entirely, though thankfully no lives beyond the terrifying scare with young Thomas Coleridge. Elena immediately began organizing emergency shelter for the displaced families, opening several of the manor's unused rooms for temporary housing, and arranging for Mr. Whitcomb to begin the process of rebuilding as soon as the ground allowed for construction in the new year. Sebastian, remarkably, remained at her side throughout these arrangements, offering resources and authority in ways he had rarely done before, deferring to her judgment on matters he had once left entirely unaddressed. It was well past midnight before the immediate crisis had been fully managed, the displaced families settled as comfortably as circumstances allowed within the manor's walls, Dr. Halloway satisfied that young Thomas would recover fully from his brief exposure to smoke. Elena finally allowed herself to sit, exhausted, in the estate office where the long day had begun, her hands still faintly trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Sebastian found her there some time later, having washed away the worst of the soot from the fire, though exhaustion still shadowed his features heavily. He sat across from her without speaking for a long moment, the silence between them different now from the careful, guarded silences of their earlier months together. This one felt weighted with shared experience, with a bond forged through genuine crisis rather than mere proximity. "You were remarkable today," he finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. "The way you organized everyone, the way you kept your composure when panic would have been far easier. I do not believe the fire could have been contained nearly so quickly without your leadership." "You ran into a burning building to save a child," Elena said, still shaken by the memory of watching him disappear into the smoke. "That was remarkable, Sebastian. I have never been more afraid in my life than I was in those minutes waiting for you to emerge." Something shifted in his expression at this admission, a vulnerability entering his eyes that Elena had rarely glimpsed from him before. "Were you afraid for my sake, or simply for the sake of what my death would mean for the estate?" "For your sake," Elena said, before she could reconsider the honesty of the answer. "Entirely for your sake, Sebastian. Whatever else remains uncertain between us, I was afraid of losing you today, not merely afraid of the practical consequences your death might bring." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Elena's already unsteady heart beat even faster. "I have spent these past weeks trying to untangle my own feelings, Elena, trying to separate old grief from whatever new thing has been growing between us since your arrival. Today, watching you organize the tenants, watching you fight so hard to save people who are not even your own blood, I found that untangling suddenly much simpler than it has been in months." "What do you mean?" I mean that when I thought, even for a moment, about what my life would look like without you in it, I found I could not bear to consider it, he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion Alina had never before heard him express so plainly. I do not know precisely when it happened, Alina. Perhaps it was watching you nurse my grandmother back to health. Perhaps it was every small kindness you have shown to tenants who had never once received such consideration from this family before. But somewhere in these past months, without my fully realizing it, my feelings for you grew into something far more than simple gratitude or respect. Alina's breath caught, torn between the cautious guardedness she had maintained so carefully since Isabel's letter and the fragile, dangerous hope that Sebastian's words now threatened to reignite within her. You said much the same in different words before Isabel's letter arrived, and then your confusion returned the moment her name entered the conversation again. I know, Sebastian said quietly, and I understand if my words mean little to you now, after everything that has passed between us. I do not ask for your trust simply because I have finally found clarity within myself. I ask only for the chance to prove that clarity through my actions, over time, rather than through words alone that have failed you before. Alina studied him carefully, weighing his words against the accumulated weight of months of careful hurt and guarded hope. She did not answer immediately, uncertain whether she was ready to trust a clarity that had wavered so completely once already. But something in the exhaustion and honesty of that long, difficult day, something in the memory of watching him emerge from the smoke with a child's life saved in his arms, softened, however slightly, the careful walls she had built around her heart. Prove it then, she finally said. Not with words, Sebastian, but with time, and with actions I can trust to remain steady even when circumstances grow difficult again. I have been disappointed before. I will not be so easily persuaded a second time. That is fair, Sebastian said, something like relief and determination mixing in his expression. That is more than fair, Alina. I intend to prove it however long it takes. They sat together a while longer in the quiet office, the exhaustion of the long day finally beginning to settle over both of them, the fragile new understanding between them still uncertain, but no longer entirely without hope. Alina did not know, as she finally rose to retire for what remained of the night, whether Sebastian's newfound clarity would prove as steady as he promised. But for the first time since Isabel's letter had shattered the careful warmth that had begun growing between them, she allowed herself to believe that something real might yet be possible between herself and the husband circumstance had given her, not through obligation or grief, but through the slow, difficult work of two people learning, gradually and against considerable odds, to truly see one another. Isabel Hargrove arrived at Ashford Manor unannounced on a bitter afternoon in late January, her carriage rolling up the snow-dusted drive with the same confident entitlement that had marked every account Alina had heard of her these past months. Alina was in the drawing room reviewing plans for the rebuilt cottages when Henry announced the visitor, his voice carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed his discomfort at the situation. Mrs. Hargrove is asking to see His Grace, Your Grace. Shall I inform her that he is unavailable? Alina considered this for a long moment, torn between the instinct to avoid the confrontation entirely and a growing certainty that avoidance would serve no one well in the end. No, show her to the blue parlor. I will receive her myself since His Grace is currently occupied in the village. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly at this, but he bowed and went to fulfill the instruction without further comment. Alina took a steadying breath, smoothed her skirts, and made her way to the blue parlor with a composure she did not entirely feel. Isabel Hargrove was, Alina had to admit upon seeing her for the first time, every bit as striking as the county gossip had suggested, elegant, poised, with dark eyes that studied Alina with obvious surprise at finding the Duchess rather than the Duke waiting to receive her. Your Grace, Isabel said, recovering quickly, her voice carrying a practiced warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. Forgive my unannounced visit. I had hoped to speak with Sebastian regarding a matter of some importance. He is not available at present, Alina said, gesturing for Isabel to sit while she herself remained standing near the fireplace. Perhaps I might assist you instead, or convey a message on your behalf. Something flickered across Isabel's composed features, irritation perhaps, at being denied her intended audience. I am not entirely certain this is a matter suited to conveying through a third party, Your Grace, however well-intentioned. I am his wife, Mrs. Hargrove, Alina said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling tighter in her chest with every passing moment. I do not believe there exists a matter concerning my husband that is inappropriate for me to hear directly. Isabel's composure cracked, however briefly, into something sharper. Very well then, Your Grace, since you insist upon directness. I came to speak with Sebastian about our future, once circumstances allow it. I understand this marriage was arranged out of obligation rather than affection, and I do not believe either of us needs to pretend otherwise between ourselves. Sebastian and I loved each other long before you entered his life, and I do not intend to simply abandon that history now that circumstance has finally freed me to pursue it. Elena felt something cold settle into her stomach, though she forced her expression to remain carefully composed. And what precisely do you believe circumstances have freed you to pursue, Mrs. Hargrove? My husband remains married, and I have no intention of releasing him from that marriage, whatever history the two of you may share. Marriages of convenience dissolve, Your Grace, when both parties come to understand where genuine happiness truly lies, Isabel said, her tone carrying an unmistakable edge of condescension now. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I believe you deserve honesty rather than false hope. Sebastian's heart has belonged to me for a decade. I do not believe a few months of dutiful marriage will have changed that, whatever kindnesses you may have shown this household in the meantime. Elena's hands clenched at her sides, though she kept her voice level through sheer force of will. You may believe whatever you wish, Mrs. Hargrove, but I would suggest you direct your certainty toward Sebastian himself rather than assuming his feelings on my behalf. I do not believe you know his heart nearly as well as you seem to think you do, not anymore. The two women regarded each other for a long, tense moment, the air in the parlor thick with unspoken challenge. It was Isabel who finally broke the silence, rising from her seat with the same practiced elegance she had maintained throughout the exchange. I will speak with him directly, then, since you insist I cannot rely on your account of matters between us, she said. Please inform him I called, and that I intend to return when he is available to receive me properly. She left without further ceremony, and Elena remained in the parlor for a long while after the sound of the departing carriage had faded, her composure finally cracking now that she was alone with the full weight of what had just transpired. She had spoken with more confidence than she truly felt, had defended a claim to her husband's heart that she was not entirely certain she possessed. Sebastian had promised, weeks ago, to prove his clarity through steady action rather than words. But Isabel's visit, and the confident certainty with which she had spoken of Sebastian's enduring feelings, threatened to unravel every fragile thread of trust Elena had begun, cautiously, to weave since the night of the fire. When Sebastian returned from the village that evening, Elena told him of Isabel's visit without softening any of the details, watching his reaction carefully for any sign of the confusion or hesitation that had once, so completely, unraveled the tentative warmth between them. To her surprise and considerable relief, his expression hardened with something closer to frustration than temptation. She has no right to speak on my behalf, to you or to anyone else. I will make my position clear to her myself, in terms that leave no further room for confusion. And what is your position, Sebastian? Elena asked, needing, after months of uncertainty, to hear it stated plainly rather than implied through actions alone. I have believed your words before and been disappointed when circumstance tested them. I need to understand clearly where matters truly stand. Sebastian crossed the room to stand directly before her, his expression more resolute than she had ever seen it. My position, Elena, is that I love you. Not the ghost of a feeling I once held for Isabel, not confusion dressed as affection, but genuine love, built slowly and honestly over these past months of watching you transform this house, this estate, and more than either of those things, my own understanding of what a true partnership can look like. Isabel belongs to my past. You are the woman I choose entirely and without hesitation for whatever future remains ahead of us. Elena's breath caught at the unexpected directness of this declaration, torn between the fragile hope it kindled and the cautious wariness that months of guarded disappointment had instilled within her. Words are easy to offer in a moment of frustration, Sebastian. I need more than that after everything. Then I will speak with Isabel myself tomorrow and make certain there remains no ambiguity for her to cling to, Sebastian said firmly. And I will continue proving my commitment through every day that follows, for as long as it takes you to trust it fully. True to his word, Sebastian rode to the Fairview house the following morning, returning several hours later with a grim but satisfied expression that suggested the conversation had been, at last, entirely conclusive. He did not offer Alina a detailed account of what had passed between himself and Isabel, and Alina, trusting the resolve she saw plainly in his bearing, did not press him for one. In the weeks that followed, Isabel Hargrove's presence in the county gradually faded from local gossip, her visits to the area growing increasingly infrequent until, by early spring, she had returned entirely to whatever life awaited her elsewhere, the chapter of her history with Sebastian finally, definitively closed. But the resolution of Isabel's lingering presence did not, Alina found, entirely settle the deeper uncertainty that had taken root within her these past difficult months. Sebastian's declaration in the parlor had been sincere, she believed that much fully. But sincerity in a single moment of resolve was not the same as the accumulated steady trust that could only be built through sustained time and consistent action. The very thing she had asked of him weeks earlier, and the very thing that recent months of confusion, however resolved, had made it difficult for her to fully believe in without reservation. She found herself, in the weeks following Isabel's departure, growing quietly more independent rather than less, throwing herself further into the estate's affairs, the schoolroom's continued growth, the steady work of rebuilding the tenant cottages lost in the fire, finding in these tangible accomplishments a sense of purpose and self-worth that did not depend on the uncertain territory of her marriage's emotional landscape. She was not withdrawing from Sebastian entirely, but she was, perhaps for the first time since her arrival at Ashford Manor, building a version of herself and her life that did not require his validation or affection to feel complete. Sebastian noticed this shift, and unlike the earlier months of their marriage, he did not retreat into distant silence in response to it. Instead, he began, with visible and consistent effort, to insert himself more fully into the life Alina had built, attending the schoolroom's spring examinations alongside her, riding with her to inspect the progress of the rebuilt cottages, joining her regularly now at Lady Margaret's evening gatherings in the East Wing, where the old woman watched the growing warmth between her grandson and his wife with unmistakable satisfaction. "He is trying," Lady Margaret observed one evening, once Sebastian had left the room to attend to some minor estate matter. "Genuinely trying, in a way I have not seen from him in all the years since Isabel first broke his heart. Do not let old wounds prevent you from recognizing real change when it stands directly in front of you, Alina." "I see the change," Alina said honestly. "I am simply no longer certain after everything how much of myself I am willing to risk trusting it fully." "That is a fair caution," Lady Margaret said, her sharp eyes softening with something like understanding. "But do not let caution calcify into permanent distance, child. There is a difference between protecting your heart and closing it entirely. I would hate to see you make that particular mistake, after everything you have already survived to reach this point." Alina did not have a ready answer for this, but she carried Lady Margaret's words with her in the days that followed, turning them over carefully as she continued the delicate, uncertain work of deciding how much trust she was willing, once again, to extend toward the husband who had finally, it seemed, begun to choose her fully. Spring had fully settled over the estate by the time the letter from Alina's father arrived, its contents delivering news that would, within a matter of days, bring the fragile uncertainty of Alina's marriage to its most difficult reckoning yet. Her father's health, never robust in the years since his financial troubles had first begun, had taken a serious turn, and her mother's letter, tucked alongside his own, begged Alina to return home as quickly as circumstances allowed. Alina informed Sebastian of the news that same evening, her hands trembling slightly as she read the letter aloud to him in the privacy of the drawing room. "I must go to them. I do not know how long I will need to remain, but I cannot leave my father to face this without me at his side." "Of course," Sebastian said immediately, without a moment's hesitation. "I will arrange the carriage myself and accompany you if you wish it." "That is not necessary," Alina said, though something in his immediate offer warmed her more than she fully expected. "I will manage the journey well enough on my own, but thank you, Sebastian, for offering." She departed the following morning, the estate's affairs left carefully in Mr. Whitcomb's capable hands, the schoolroom entrusted to Prudence's continued oversight, her heart heavy with worry for her father even as some smaller, quieter part of her registered, with genuine surprise, how much she had come to think of Ashford Manor as home in the months since her difficult arrival there. Her father's condition proved more serious than the letters had initially conveyed, a weakness of the heart that Dr. Halloway's counterpart in her family's own county described in grave terms. urging rest and careful management rather than any hope of full recovery. Elena remained at her family home for nearly 6 weeks, nursing her father through his most difficult days, comforting her frightened mother, and offering what steady presence she could to her younger sister Charlotte, who had grown considerably in maturity since Elena's own marriage had first secured the family's financial stability. Sebastian wrote to her regularly throughout those difficult weeks, his letters carrying none of the cold distance that had once characterized every exchange between them, filled instead with genuine warmth, updates on the estate and its tenants, gentle inquiries after her father's health, and small, careful admissions of how deeply he missed her presence within the walls of Ashford Manor. Elena found herself, despite every remaining reservation, looking forward to these letters with an eagerness that surprised her, reading each one several times over before carefully folding it away among her most treasured possessions. It was during this extended absence, in a quiet moment of reflection amid the exhausting work of caring for her ailing father, that Elena finally allowed herself to fully examine the feelings she had spent so many months trying carefully to guard against. She had married Sebastian out of obligation, had endured months of painful indifference and the humiliating shadow of Isabel's enduring presence in his heart. But somewhere amid the fire that had nearly claimed a child's life, the long vigil at Lady Margaret's bedside, the steady accumulation of small kindnesses and genuine effort these past months, something had shifted within Elena as surely as it had shifted within Sebastian himself. She loved him. The realization arrived not as a sudden revelation but as a quiet, settled certainty, one that had clearly been growing within her for far longer than she had allowed herself to consciously acknowledge. And with that realization came a new and uncomfortable question. What precisely was she prepared to do about feelings she had spent so many months carefully guarding against, for fear of exactly this kind of vulnerability? Her father's health stabilized enough by the 6th week that Dr. Holloway's counterpart deemed it safe for Elena to return to her own household, with the understanding that further visits would be necessary as her father's condition required ongoing management. Elena prepared for her return to Ashford Manor with a complicated mixture of relief and anxiety, uncertain how the accumulated weeks of separation and quiet self-reflection might have shifted the delicate equilibrium she had left behind. She arrived at the manor on a warm afternoon in early summer, the gardens in full bloom, the estate humming with the particular energy of a household that had, in her absence, continued the steady work of rebuilding and growth she had set in motion months earlier. Sebastian met her carriage personally, his expression carrying an openness and warmth that immediately settled some of the anxiety that had accompanied her throughout the long journey home. "You look well," he said, helping her down from the carriage with a gentleness that had become entirely natural between them over these past months. "How is your father?" "Improving, though slowly," Elena said. "Dr. Holloway's colleague believes he will recover a reasonable measure of his strength, though he will need to manage his health carefully for the remainder of his years." "I am glad to hear it," Sebastian said, and something in his voice carried a sincerity that Elena, despite months of accumulated trust, still found herself faintly surprised by. "I have missed you terribly these past weeks, Elena. The house has felt different in your absence, quieter in ways I did not expect to notice so acutely." Elena studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity of his words against the quiet certainty she herself had reached during her weeks away. "I have missed you as well, Sebastian, more than I expected to." They settled back into the rhythms of their shared life over the following days, though something had subtly shifted between them, a new ease and warmth that neither entirely acknowledged aloud, but that both seemed quietly to recognize and welcome. Elena found herself, for the first time since her arrival at Ashford Manor nearly a year earlier, genuinely happy within the walls of her marriage, not despite the difficult circumstances that had brought her there, but through the slow, hard-won partnership she and Sebastian had built together across months of crisis, misunderstanding, and gradual, genuine growth. It was nearly a month after Elena's return, on a warm evening in midsummer, that circumstance delivered one final test to the fragile trust they had built. A letter arrived from a mutual acquaintance, mentioning, almost in passing, that Isabel Hargrove had recently become engaged to a wealthy merchant in the northern counties, news that seemed to close, finally and definitively, the last remaining chapter of Sebastian's complicated history with the woman who had once so thoroughly haunted their marriage's earliest months. Elena told Sebastian of the news that evening, watching his reaction carefully out of habits that months of hard-won trust had not entirely erased. To her genuine relief, his expression carried nothing but simple, uncomplicated gladness. "I am glad for her," he said simply. "Truly glad, Alina, without a single trace of the confusion or regret you might once have expected from me. Whatever I once felt for Isabel, it belongs entirely to the past now, a past I no longer have any desire to revisit." Alina believed him fully, for the first time without any lingering reservation, and something settled within her heart at the recognition, a final release of the guarded caution she had carried since the earliest, most painful days of their marriage. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with an ease that had become entirely natural between them. "I love you," Alina said, the words emerging with a simple, unguarded honesty she had waited many months to feel confident enough to express. "I did not expect to, given how our marriage began. But I do, Sebastian, fully and without reservation." Sebastian's expression transformed at these words, something like joy and relief mixing across his features in a way Alina had never before witnessed from him. "Alina, I have loved you for months now, though I have perhaps not always shown it as clearly or as consistently as you deserved. I love you more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone, and I am endlessly grateful every single day that circumstance brought you into my life, even through such difficult beginnings." He drew her into his arms, and Alina allowed herself, finally, to fully embrace the happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach within this marriage. The road that had brought them to this moment had been long and often painful, beginning with a bride left standing alone in the rain, winding through months of guarded distance, the shadow of a rival's enduring presence, and the slow, difficult work of two wounded people learning, gradually, to trust and choose each other fully. But standing together now in the warm summer evening, their hands clasped and their hearts finally, mutually acknowledged, Alina understood that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, she and Sebastian would face them together, as true partners rather than strangers bound merely by obligation. Lady Margaret, watching the couple from her window in the east wing, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile at the sight below, murmuring quietly to herself words that carried the weight of years of patient hope finally, fully realized. "At last," she said softly, "he sees her. At last he truly sees her." The gardens below, once neglected and overgrown when Alina had first arrived at Ashford Manor nearly a year earlier, now bloomed in full, vibrant color, tended carefully by a household that had learned, under Alina's steady guidance, to care fully for the land and people entrusted to it. It was, Alina reflected later that evening, a fitting reflection of her own journey within these walls, from an unwanted bride standing alone in cold rain, to a duchess who had built, through patience, resilience, and genuine strength, a life and a love entirely her own, chosen freely at last by a husband who had finally learned to see her fully for everything she truly was. The following autumn brought changes to Ashford Manor that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first cold, silent months of Alina's arrival. The gardens, once neglected and forgotten, now flourished under the careful attention of a gardener Alina herself had hired, their pathways lined with the same roses her mother had once grown at her childhood home, a small piece of her old life woven carefully into her new one. The tenant cottages destroyed in the fire had been fully rebuilt by early summer, sturdier and better constructed than before, a lasting testament to the partnership Alina and Sebastian had forged through that difficult crisis. Lady Margaret's health, though never fully what it had once been before her illness, remained steady through careful management and the daily company of a granddaughter-in-law who had become, over the past year, as dear to her as any blood relation. The old woman had taken to spending her afternoons in the gardens now rather than confined entirely to her chambers, often accompanied by Alina, the two of them sharing quiet conversations that had grown, over many months, into a genuine and treasured friendship. Charlotte, too, had flourished under the influence of a sister-in-law who treated her not as a child to be managed, but as a young woman whose thoughts and opinions genuinely mattered. She had grown more confident, more thoughtful, her natural warmth and curiosity finding steady encouragement, rather than the distant indifference that had characterized much of her earlier upbringing within the Ashford household. When a promising young gentleman from a neighboring estate began calling on her with increasing frequency that autumn, it was Alina she turned to for counsel, trusting her sister-in-law's judgment in matters of the heart more than anyone else's in her life. The schoolroom in the village had expanded twice over since its humble beginnings, now employing 2 full-time tutors and serving nearly 40 children from across the estate's tenant families. Several of its earliest students, including young Thomas Coleridge, whose life Sebastian had once saved from the flames that nearly claimed his family's cottage, had shown particular promise, and Alina had begun quietly arranging for the most gifted among them to receive further education beyond what the village schoolroom alone could offer, determined that circumstance of birth would not limit what these children might yet achieve. Sebastian, for his part, had transformed as thoroughly as the estate itself over the course of that remarkable year. The distant, grief-hardened man who had once left his bride standing alone in the rain had given way to a husband and duke who took genuine, active interest in every aspect of the estate's management and his tenants' welfare. He rode with Alina regularly now, inspecting the estate's affairs together rather than leaving such matters entirely to her care, learning from her steady example even as she, in turn, learned to lean on his growing strength and partnership in ways she had once believed impossible within their marriage. Their evenings together had become, by that autumn, the quiet centerpiece of Alina's happiness, long conversations by the fire in the library, where their marriage's earliest painful silences had once dwelt, shared laughter over the small triumphs and challenges of estate life, the comfortable, easy companionship of two people who had weathered genuine hardship together and emerged from it with a bond far stronger than either could have imagined during those difficult early months. It was on a crisp evening in late October, nearly to the day of their first wedding anniversary, that Sebastian found Alina in the library once more, though this time the atmosphere between them carried none of the painful tension that had once defined so many of their exchanges within that particular room. "Do you remember," he said, settling into the chair beside hers rather than across from her, a small but meaningful shift in the physical distance they now comfortably maintained, "the first time I found you here searching for a book, and I could not even manage to look at you properly?" "I remember," Alina said softly, reaching for his hand as she often did now, the gesture entirely natural between them. "I remember thinking I had married a stranger who would never truly see me." "I am endlessly grateful you were wrong," Sebastian said, bringing her hand gently to his lips. "I do not believe I properly understood that first difficult year, what a gift it was that circumstance brought you into my life, however painful our beginning may have been. You transformed this house, Alina. More than that, you transformed me, taught me what genuine partnership and genuine love could look like, after so many years of believing myself incapable of either." Alina studied her husband's face in the warm firelight, seeing in his expression none of the guarded distance or lingering grief that had once shadowed every interaction between them. "We transformed each other, Sebastian. I was not the same woman who arrived here that first rainy evening, uncertain and afraid. This place, and you, taught me my own strength in ways I never fully understood before." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, the weight of a difficult but ultimately triumphant year settling comfortably between them. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the trees along the estate's long drive, the same drive down which Alina had once arrived as an unwanted bride, and down which she now walked freely and happily each day as the true mistress of a house that had at long last become genuinely and completely her home. News arrived some weeks later that would add one final layer of joy to what had already become the happiest period of Alina's life. Dr. Halloway, called to examine her after several weeks of unexplained fatigue, delivered the news with a warm, knowing smile that told Alina, even before his words fully registered, exactly what he intended to say. "Your Grace," he said, "I believe congratulations are in order. You are expecting a child, likely due sometime in early summer." Alina's hands flew to her stomach, tears springing unbidden to her eyes as the full weight of this news settled over her. She had come to Ashford Manor as an unwanted bride, uncertain of her place, uncertain of any future happiness within these walls. Now, less than 18 months later, she stood as a beloved wife, a respected duchess, and soon a mother to a child conceived in genuine love rather than mere obligation. She found Sebastian in the estate office, reviewing the winter's tenant repair requests with the same diligent care he had learned, over their year together, to bring to every aspect of the estate's management. He looked up at her entrance, his expression immediately shifting to concern at whatever emotion he read plainly on her face. "Alina, what is it? Are you unwell?" "I am entirely well," she said, her voice thick with happy tears as she crossed the room to stand before him. "Better than well, Sebastian. Dr. Halloway has just confirmed that we are expecting a child." Sebastian rose from his chair so quickly it nearly toppled behind him, his face transforming with a joy so complete and unguarded that Alina felt her own happiness swell to match it entirely. He gathered her carefully into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the entire world, which in that moment she supposed she truly was to him. "A child," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Alina, this is the happiest news I have ever received. I love you so completely, and I cannot wait to build a family with you, to raise a child who will grow up knowing nothing but genuine love and partnership between their parents, unlike the cold distance that defined so much of my own childhood in this house. Our child will know love," Alina promised, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "We will make certain of that together, just as we have built everything else these past months." Lady Margaret, upon hearing the news, wept openly for the first time Alina had ever witnessed from the sharp, composed old woman, declaring immediately her intention to remain in good health long enough to meet her first great-grandchild, whatever effort that might require of her. Charlotte, delighted beyond measure, immediately began planning elaborate nursery decorations that Alina gently but firmly had to moderate to something more practical. The tenants, upon learning the news, sent gifts and well-wishes from across the estate, small tokens of a genuine affection that Alina had earned through months of dedicated care rather than mere obligation of rank. As winter settled once more over Ashford Manor, Alina found herself reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point in her life. She thought sometimes of that first difficult night, standing alone in the cold rain while her husband walked past her without a word, the humiliation and fear that had settled so heavily over her in those early days. She thought of Isabel's confident, wounding letter, of the long nights of uncertain grief that had followed, of the countless moments when hope had seemed entirely foolish given the painful circumstances of her marriage's beginning. But she thought too of everything that had grown from those difficult beginnings, the fire that had tested and ultimately strengthened her marriage rather than destroying it, the slow, patient work of building genuine partnership through consistent action rather than empty words, the gradual, hard-won trust that had finally allowed her heart to open fully to a love she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. She reflected on a quiet winter evening, sitting by the fire with Sebastian's hand resting gently over the growing curve of her stomach, precisely where she was meant to be, not because circumstance had delivered her here through an arranged marriage neither of them had originally wanted, but because she and Sebastian had each chosen, through countless difficult moments and genuine effort, to build something real and lasting from what had once seemed like nothing more than obligation and duty. Ashford Manor, once cold and silent, now rang with laughter, with purpose, with the steady warmth of a family built through genuine love rather than mere circumstance. And Alina, once an unwanted bride standing alone in the rain, had become, through her own resilience, patience, and quiet strength, not merely a duchess by title, but the true and beloved heart of the house and family she now called entirely her own.